বৰঠাকুৰ IS একাডেমি প্ৰস্তুতি আৰু অধ্যয়নৰ নিৰ্ভৰযোগ্য ঠিকনা।
Hello everyone, welcome to the Hindu analysis for 25th May 2021. Let us begin with the first article today. Today we will be studying two articles at the same time because they are correlated and interdependent on one another. The first one is migrant workers may just want to go to home, says Supreme Court. So this is in regards to the Supreme Court's suo motu case on the crisis of migrant workers. So a bench of Justice Ashok Bhushan and Shah was hearing a suo motu case to provide migrant laborers and families who are marooned in big cities with dry rations and cooked food, and along with it public transport to these workers if they wish to go to their native villages. So this case is pertaining to where the Supreme Court realized there was certain inaction from the part of state governments and central governments, and realized that there is an urgent need to address the crisis of migrants and try to solve their issues, or at least try to ensure that they are taken care of during this crisis, because due to many lockdowns there is a lack of availability of work which highly dents their ability to make a living and feed their family. Now the government, the central government in this case, has quickly submitted a statement, or they submitted a statement that they have opened control rooms to address the migrant woes, and also assured that the possibility or the responsibility to give these people food or serve these people food, particularly either it may be dry rations or provide cooked food for them or provide transportation for these people, is the responsibility of the state, not of the central government. To which the court did not like what the central government is saying, or did not agree with the submission given by the central government. Again, Justice Bhushan said that the document mentioned only people covered under Food Security Act. This is absolutely true. So when the central government says that they have been providing food grains to these people, whether dry rations or cooked food in certain cases, it is talking about people who are covered under only the Food Security Act. Those migrant workers who move from one place to other place in search of work, who do not possess ration cards or who do not come under the Food Security Act, these people are largely left unattended to. Now the government also expected that the government was of the opinion that they were doing whatever they can at the fullest, but the Supreme Court disagreed with the view of the government. Again, Justice Bhushan has clearly indicated that the government should consider and initiate steps towards addressing people who do not come under the Food Security Act, meaning those people who do not possess ration cards because of their moving nature from one place to other place in search of work. Now the court rightly has asked for the central government to file a further affidavit detailing every action that it had taken to provide dry rations to migrant workers under the Atmanirbhar scheme. So during the migrant crisis in the first wave of coronavirus, the government initiated this scheme called the Atmanirbhar Bharat Initiative or Bharat scheme, which was entrusted with the job of providing dry rations to migrant workers. So initially, during the beginning of the hearing, though Justice Bhushan sounded very skeptical why the migrants' plight in the second wave was bad as it was during the last wave, because during the first wave we clearly see what these people were going through, what were the uncertainties surrounding these people's decision, meaning the migrant workers' decision to move back to their native villages. Since we had already gone through this process once before to greater extent, where people died on the road while they were traveling back to their villages, at least the government would have realized what was at stake and what was needed to be done to address this issue, and would have taken necessary steps to ensure that the repeat of migrant crisis or the exodus of migrant workers from big cities to their native villages wouldn't take place in the second wave. Now, as far as the current situation is concerned, the Supreme Court has ordered both central government to file an affidavit and asked for it to come out with a cohesive plan or a comprehensive plan to address migrant OOs who are stranded in cities, those who are willing to or wishing to travel back to their villages, and also what it is doing in terms of ensuring food security to these people. In addition to that, the second article, that is provide food rations to stranded workers, Supreme Court, in the same hearing, the Supreme Court has asked states across the country to distribute dry rations to stranded workers. They had ordered this to states, stating that even if they don't possess ration card, please give them dry rations, and it is your duty and it is your job to run community kitchens for them. As far as their part of thing, the Supreme Court has asked all states to file affidavits indicating the mechanism that they have already employed or in the process of implementing, in which or by which the dry ration is being distributed to these migrant workers, and also to the migrant workers who do not possess a ration card. During this judgment, the Supreme Court clearly indicated that it rests upon the state to choose which scheme that they want to implement, whether they want to implement the central government's Atmanirbhar Bharat scheme or they want to come up with their own scheme which aims to provide dry rations to migrant workers. As I said earlier, the Atmanirbhar Bharat scheme, which was launched in 2020 of June and May, with the sole purpose of providing dry rations to these migrant workers. Now, the bench held that the responsibility of states and union territories in running community kitchens is of paramount importance to meet the needs of the laborers, because they lost their employment due to the current mini lockdowns or whatever we call them now, and it is up to, or the responsibility lies with states and the union territories to provide at least 2 meals a day to these migrant laborers. And the bench also directed that the states must and the union territories must provide wide publicity to all the schemes and welfare schemes that are aimed towards migrant workers, and also provide locations for these community kitchens so that the people who need them the most would know where they would get their meals. But simultaneously, the Supreme Court also refused a plea to direct states to provide direct cash transfer to these migrant workers, saying that as far as the food security is concerned, we are willing to go as far as ordering the states to ensure that they distribute dry rations and provide community kitchens where these people would be fed at least 2 times a day. While coming to the idea of direct cash transfers to these migrant workers, it's a matter of policy concerning individual states and UTs, and rescued itself. Now, this is the Sumoto case in regards to the central government with Justice Bhushan bench, and this is in regards to the Supreme Court with a different bench addressing the needs of migrant workers from the perspective of state governments and union territories. Moving to the next article, SC urged by absence of migrant database. So one of the first things that we realized in the first exodus of migrant workers was the lack of a comprehensive or a clear database of migrant workers. This lack of database led to a widespread chaos where the government did not know where to allocate resources to stem the flow of migrants from major cities to their respective villages, or come out with an effective plan to address the transportation issues, lack of food or whatnot during the migrant exodus from cities to villages. Now again, the perception was that since we experienced this kind of a situation in the first wave, at least the state governments and the central government would have come up with a plan or a scheme that would ensure that this migrant workers database is created. If it didn't exist earlier, it should have been in at least motion right now. But there is a clear delay in completing a national database to identify and register migrant workers so that benefits can be provided to them directly in times of this crisis like situations. Again, the Supreme Court was hearing a petition on Monday where they were not impressed by both central government and state governments' inability to complete the process of registration of organized workers at an earlier date, and also unorganized workers are not able to reap the benefits of different schemes of the central government. The court observed that without the proper implementation of the identity card or having a proper identification system, it will be very difficult to implement all the schemes that the state governments and the central government is bringing to address the needs of the migrants. So now the Supreme Court observed that a uniform national data grid of migrant workers, particularly from Justice Bhushan himself, in which both the central and state provide inputs, should be there, and this would ensure that benefits meant for migrants workers reach them and no other. Again, the court has asked the governments to clarify what steps it had taken under the Code of Social Security of 2020, and also during the hearing, Justice Shah clearly pointed out that many migrant workers or workers are illiterate and they may not able to register on online platforms, and as the role of welfare government, it is the government's obligation to reach out to these workers and their employers and their contractors and ensure the compliance with registering themselves online or on this portal. As far as the government stand is concerned, the Labour Ministry stated that they have started working on this database and assured the court that they would be talking to necessary officers and ensure the speedy completion to the database creation. The immediate handing out of dry rations, cooked food during the second wave should not depend on the completion of this database. That's it. These are the three articles that are related to cases that are being taken up and heard by the Supreme Court of India regarding the second migrant crisis that is unfolding during the second wave of coronavirus pandemic. Moving on to the next article, take action to protect Balswa Lake from pollution, says National Green Tribunal. So what is the story here? Like every other lake in India, this lake is also suffering from three primary causes. One is encroachments, two is cutoff of access to its water inflow and outflow, three is extensive pollution by way of garbage and other means. Now, the National Green Tribunal has directed the Delhi Chief Secretary to set up a meeting and take immediate remedial action to protect Balswa Lake against pollution and encroachment. If you go to Google and search for this lake and look at the maps and images, it is clearly indicative that there is an extensive case of encroachments in construction encroachments into this lake, and there is a widescale pollution levels in this lake also. Now, the Green Panel has also directed the Delhi Pollution Control Committee (DPCC) to monitor the water quality data of this lake, particular lake, periodically and put it in public domain. Now, during this hearing, which was headed by the NGT chairperson Justice Adarsh Kumar, said that it is an undoubted mandate of law to maintain the water bodies in their pristine glories, as water bodies perform important ecological functions. Not only do they add to the aesthetics, they help in water conservation, sustaining aquatic life, and maintaining microclimate. clean environment being part of right to life and also being part of directive principles of state policy, the state authorities have the duty to protect the same. As far as what the Delhi government should be doing, the court has ordered or directed the Delhi Chief Secretary to ensure a mechanism set in place to address all the issues that were pointed out by the National Green Tribunal. Moving on to the next article, a September exit, Afghanistan at the crossroads. Now, US President Biden has clearly indicated that whatever the ground realities may be, whatever the ground situation in regards to a peace agreement between or power sharing agreement between the Afghan government and the Taliban, irrespective of the outcome of that negotiation or that deal, America is going to comprehensively complete its troop withdrawal by September 11. So, since Trump announced that America is going to exit out of its 2-decade war against insurgents in Afghanistan, there has been going a lot of uncertainty floating around the air in terms of what will be the future of Afghanistan once American troops pull out of Afghanistan. There are certain exigencies that exist that are unanswered till now. Despite that, what is the ground situation there? Now, the fragile Afghan peace process has been in a disarray because Washington wanted these negotiations between the peace negotiators and the Taliban to be held in Istanbul, Turkey, under the flag of United Nations. Turkey had this meeting was scheduled for late April and early May, but Taliban is refusing to engage with this body for negotiations, not because they don't want to have a negotiations or a peace deal with the Americans, but they don't want that meeting to take place in Turkey. They want that meeting to take place in Doha. So few days back there was an impasse in their stand where Taliban has expressed openness to attend the Istanbul summit, but on one condition, that the final agreement, the final Afghan peace deal should be achieved and signed in Doha, Qatar. Why this indifference to the places? So when the negotiations come, it comes down to or boils down to the place of the power that the negotiator holds to. For whatever reasons, one of the primary reasons is Qatar being one of the sponsors of Taliban, and Qatar being very comfortable hosting Taliban in their territory. It seems that Taliban wants to have a deal signed in Qatar territory. Now, coming back to the Istanbul summit or Istanbul conference, it is being calibrated by the Biden administration with its plans to completely withdraw from war-torn Afghanistan. Since the first arrival of American troops into Afghanistan 20 years back, it has been a never-ending war and it has imposed huge costs on Americans, both in terms of fatalities and in terms of finances. Now, what is the current situation in terms of Afghan peace deal? At this point of time, there is no proper power sharing deal between both the parties, that is the Afghan elected government and the Taliban. Since the idea of a peace deal has been floated by the Americans, there has been a significant increase in level of violence whenever there is a meeting scheduled. Recently, Taliban conducted a suicide bombing near a school which killed around 40 innocent children, particularly girls. And this kind of sets the tone for the future of Afghanistan. If a proper power sharing deal between both the parties is not achieved. Since Biden announced that September 11 is the exit date for American troops from Afghanistan, where it will be a complete withdrawal without any residue forces, Afghanistan has been seeing continuous deadly attacks across its provinces. So before understanding what is happening in Afghanistan, let us understand ground realities. Who controls what in Afghanistan? So in the dark blue color, whatever you are saying, particularly in the case of Hemland, Sharipal, Ghazni, Kunar and Kunduz, these areas are predominantly dominated by Taliban. Particularly in the cases and the regions of Sharipul and Ghazni, the Taliban is known to be very deadly and vicious. So when you compare the Taliban operating out of Ghazni, Sharipul with the areas with the Taliban that is controlling Kunduz and Kunar, these people are very violent, very vicious when compared to their counterparts in Kunduz or Kandahar. So the dark blue area is where Taliban is in complete control. When light blue areas, the Taliban and the government are at constant loggerheads, but these regions are predominantly controlled by Taliban also. If you see at Kabul, it is completely surrounded by Taliban forces. Kabul is the capital city. That's the case with Kabul itself. Imagine what it would be going on in other far-reaching regions like areas like Farah and Hemland provinces. And the white areas are the areas where the government has control, meaning the Afghan security forces have complete dominance over these areas. But every day, the Afghan government is losing control of territory from Taliban. Now this is the ground reality here. Earlier it was thought that majority of the area was controlled by government when US forces were present. Particularly, let me give you the example of Hemland province. American troops and coalition troops fought to gain control of Hemland province twice. The first assault, American troops were inserted in the middle of insurgents and they fought their way out of Hemland province and gave the control back to Afghan National Security Forces. After giving the control, the Americans pulled back out of the Hemland province to show that Afghan police and Afghan army can take care of their own. But immediately after giving control of Hemland to Afghan forces, Taliban attacked and took over Hemland province. Again, after a few months, the Americans mounted one more assault on Hemland and gained control of Hemland province and again gave it back to Afghan security forces, which they subsequently lost to Taliban again, and it again rests with Taliban. So that is the case with Afghan security forces. So there are a lot of issues when it comes to Afghan National Security Forces. Either it may be army or it may be the police. There are high levels of corruption in the forces itself, and there is a lot of mistrust, which is very surprising in any police force or in any army or Afghan security forces in this case. So one commander operating in one area does not trust the other commander operating in other area. So there is a lot of mistrust in the society of Afghanistan itself, and that has directly filtered down into Afghan police and Afghan security forces. So this is the current ground reality in Afghanistan. If you are under the illusion that large portion of area is controlled by the government, that is the central authority, you might be mistaken. To this day, majority of the portion is either contested by Taliban or completely under the control of Taliban, without any scope for the central led authority to have any functioning role in these regions. So if you can see, certain regions are completely cut off from the central region, though they control it, as Taliban or Taliban affiliates have surrounded those regions. So there are a lot of complexities that go into a power sharing deal in Afghanistan. So once you see this map, you can clearly understand why there is a need for power sharing, because the central government doesn't control that much of territory to have complete control over the Afghanistan governance. So it has to be a power sharing deal between Taliban and the Afghani democratically elected government. So moving on, the Taliban had adopted a tough posture, but they have been clearly engaging with the peace negotiators, though taking the side route of mounting suicide attacks and other attacks to keep the pressure on American forces and Taliban forces. So they have finally met in Qatar on May 14th during the second day of the 3-day ceasefire that Taliban announced to facilitate for the festival of Ramzan. So now the question rises whether all the Taliban wants a peace deal with Americans, or is there a difference among themselves? So Taliban is a very unorganized group of fighters where they have field commanders who control territory. So when you look at the ground level, there is a difference of opinion among the field commanders. There is a certain percentage of field commanders or the leadership of Taliban which wants to have a peace deal, and they see the urgency of resuming negotiations so that they can completely negotiate a peace deal, because the advantage of the current peace process negotiations is that majority of the countries in the world have legally recognized Taliban as a negotiating partner. So in the initial stage of the fight against the insurgents in Afghanistan, America refused to identify Taliban as a legitimate organization. Now, in order to have a peace deal and in order to have a legal negotiations with them, America and certain other countries were forced to recognize the legitimacy of Taliban internationally. So there is this core group of leadership, Taliban leadership, central leadership, that realizes the urgency to clinch a peace deal with US and Afghan central government, because they feel that if they don't have that agreement, there is a risk of losing this international legitimacy that they are enjoying at this moment right now. Now comes the role of Pakistan. So Pakistan enjoys the patronage of Taliban because they are completely engaging with Taliban leaders, both field commanders and central leadership, either way of coercion or compulsion, whatever you call it. But at the end of the day, Pakistan does enjoy a wide variety of access and control over Taliban that is operating out of Afghanistan. As far as the negotiations and the agreement is set, President Biden did not set timeline to this, and this has forced many stakeholders to recalibrate their position in terms of securing Afghan peace deal, particularly in the case of Pakistan. For almost 2 decades that Americans were in Afghanistan, or Americans were stationed in Afghanistan, the biggest beneficiary of this particular deployment from the United States was Pakistan, because American troops were heavily reliant on Pakistan in terms of operational and other support assistance. As a result of this, Pakistan not only treated the US as its geopolitical pawn, but has effectively ensured and mobilized this as a factor against India. For the past 20 years, there are multiple instances where Pakistan used its situational awareness in terms of Americans' dependency on them for operational and other support, supply chain support, and used this as a leverage against Indian interests in Washington. Now, so Pakistan army is in essence the control that controls Pakistan, and the Pakistan army chief Bajwa cannot keep America invested in his country either militarily, economically, or societal fronts without partnering with US to ensure smooth transition of power in Kabul. It is in the best interest of Pakistan to ensure a smooth agreement between warring parties, that is Taliban and the Afghan government, and ensure a smooth power transfer in Kabul. And the problem boils down to Ashraf Ghani, who is the current president of Afghanistan. Now we established that the Taliban does enjoy a close relationship with Pakistan because of the control that Pakistan agencies exert over Taliban central and field level leadership. Now, what is the type of relationship that the Western backed and Taliban opposed Kabul central government, that is run by Mr. Ashraf Ghani, enjoys with Pakistan? 2 words come to mind. One is deep hostility and mistrust. Even though the External Affairs Minister, the head of inter-services agencies, everybody went and met Ashraf Ghani and promised Ashraf Ghani that Pakistan is in support of clinching a peace deal with Taliban and ensuring a smooth transfer of power. Mr. Afghani came out and said that and accused Pakistan of running an organized system of support for Afghan Taliban. Now, one of the key essential elements of President Biden's plan to ensure peace in Afghanistan is to make Mr. Ashraf Ghani to dissolve his government and set up a new government system that would include Taliban and could finally decide the future distribution of power and and this means that certain amendments had to be made to the Afghan constitution. But President Ashraf Ghani has been very vocal in opposing the proposal made by President Biden. He has been very vocal in stating that he doesn't want this to happen. And post his controversial re-election, there are a lot of political power centers based out of Kabul who are extensively working against Mr. Ashraf Ghani, and they are destabilizing the peace talks with Taliban. Now, it can be said that Taliban enjoys more support from regional powers likes of Russia, China and Iran than the Western-backed Afghan government. The Taliban gets its support from Pakistan, China, Russia, Iran, though indirectly, but in the case of Iran directly supports Taliban and they hate Ashraf Ghani and Ashraf Ghani's democratically elected government. During the second re-election of Mr. Ashraf Ghani, there has been a lot of accusations thrown at him stating that he had mismanaged everything, there was a lot of corruption and he cheated, or he came to power again through way of nefarious means. But at the end of the day, he is elected democratically and he is the elected leader of Afghanistan. Now, what is the role that these regional powers play in what is happening in Afghanistan? Though these countries, both Russia and China, have clearly said that they don't have any particular lenience towards Taliban, but at the end of the day, they do enjoy certain privileges that come with having a close relationship with Taliban. The country that enjoyed most out of these instability is one, Pakistan. The second position comes to China, because China has been exploiting the current uncertainty in Afghanistan like left, right and center. So China, which has earned notoriety for being free rider in Afghanistan, is currently in soup. Because at the onset of the idea of American troop withdrawal, China has been publicly shouting that America should leave Afghanistan. But over the period, the Chinese policymakers became very comfortable with the presence of American troops in Afghanistan because one, these troops in Afghanistan ensured that the Chinese projects were protected. Two, these American troops who were stationed and functioning out of Afghanistan ensured that many terrorist groups which were threatening the Chinese directly and were threatening Beijing ambitions and plans in Central Asia were under control because American troops were taking care of them. Now, if the regional framework failed to achieve a peace deal, Beijing is ready to ask for UN intervention in Afghanistan, because this was publicly stated by Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and he clearly stated that if America fails to secure a peace deal, that is an Afghan peace deal, China is going to ask UN intervention in Afghanistan, meaning the presence of UN troops in Afghanistan. The Chinese position doesn't come out of interest in ensuring peace in Afghanistan, but out of the necessity to protect their own interests in Afghanistan. What is the role of India right now? India has been since the beginning the only regional backer of the Afghan government. The Americans realized that there are two factions of Taliban. One is good Taliban and the bad Taliban. Good Taliban are the people, are the Taliban field commanders who are willing to have or engage with Americans and ensure a stable peace in the area that they dominate in. So there was this concept where Americans were engaging with Taliban field commanders who were willing to work with them to ensure peace in their region. And the Ba'ath Taliban was considered to be the faction of Taliban which attacked indiscriminately and had no interest in ensuring a stable and peaceful Afghanistan. But when this idea was proposed to the Indian government of engaging with a good Taliban that enjoys the patronage of American troops, India refused to do so and clubbed everybody into one basket of deplorables and said that we are not going to engage with Taliban. So this ensured that if India was willing to engage with that soft standing Taliban group, we would have had an edge in this peace process. Since we have been reluctant to engage with the Taliban, we don't have a standing with Taliban forces. So understand this. Do Taliban hate India? The answer is no. If you go and ask the Taliban central leadership, certain people in the central leadership do hate India, but majority of the Taliban field commanders and local leaders and Taliban central leadership actually don't have anything against India. They hate Pakistan more than India. If you ask them, they say outly that even though they are in bed with Pakistan, they actively hate Pakistan and they have no qualms about India, because there are certain cases of Taliban leadership where they clearly said that their family has been a direct beneficiary of Indian activities in Afghanistan. One of the leaders, one of the commanders, or one of the field commanders was saying that due to India was building a road in his region, his family got benefited because his family members were employed in the construction of that road or that infrastructure project. So when you ask the direct question, do Afghan Taliban hate India? The answer is indifferent. They don't care, because India has never set a foot in Afghanistan or tried to control them in any way. All we tried to do was, though it was our own self-interest that we were trying to do this, we never directly engaged or meddled with the inner workings of Afghan society. We never went to Afghanistan and said that you are an uncultured society and you have to change your societal structure. We never meddled with their societal norms or societal structures. We were very pretty clear of what we want to do in Afghanistan. We said that we are going to negotiate with the democratically elected government. We are not going to negotiate with Taliban. Our interest lies in securing Afghan peace deal, and we are going to do through this investment through infrastructure, and we'll train your soldiers. So the answer to that question, though we don't read about it much, the answer is they don't actually have any bad intentions towards India. So the word bad intentions is wrong. They are indifferent towards India, but they actively hate Pakistan. So the inherent advantage that India has here is Taliban doesn't hate, or at least certain percentage of Taliban doesn't hate India. So we have to use this to our advantage and edge out Pakistan out of Afghanistan. That is the only way India can ensure a complete security in Afghanistan in way of protecting itself and its assets from Chinese influence and Pakistan influence. So let me tell you, will this happen overnight? No, because Pakistan has deep roots in Afghan Taliban. But does that mean that India doesn't stand a chance in having a effective relationship with Taliban? No, we are an advantage compared to Pakistan. They don't hate us. We have an opening with them. All we have to do is realize the ground realities, understand the possibilities, and start be willing to negotiating with this Taliban. You don't have to group everybody into the bad basket. There are certain leadership in Taliban who are actually indifferent towards India and have no intention of hurting or harming Indian interests, because they have been the direct beneficiaries of Indian policies in Afghanistan. So if you gain enough trust with them and try to bring a certain group of these Taliban people who have deep mistrust among themselves and club them together, they'll ensure that they'll stand for your interests in Afghanistan. So that is the approach the Indian should take while coming to the Afghanistan peace process or our future prospects in Afghanistan. To conclude this, September 11th is looming very near, and at any cost, Biden has clearly indicated that US is going to pull out of Afghanistan, and they are very much interested in ending whatever that has been going for the last 2 decades, as I said earlier, which has imposed huge costs both in terms of fatalities and in terms of finances to American war chest. Will they pull out if there isn't a peace deal in place? They're absolutely going to pull out even there isn't a peace deal finalized between Taliban and Afghan government. So when the American troops leave, if Taliban decides to abandon the peace process and mount a full-scale assault on Afghan government, Afghanistan is going to descend into chaos, and a civil war is already brewing in Afghanistan, and that civil war is going to take central stage. Coming to the next article, Wuhan lab staff fell sick in November of 2019 according to a report. So since recently there has been this theory that has regained significance called the lab leak theory. When the coronavirus pandemic first started in Wuhan, the Chinese government said that they saw the first case of SARS-CoV-2 at wet markets in Wuhan. China has been pretty clear that this has been the first instance of SARS-CoV-2 where they hypothesized that the virus migrated from a pangolin to a human at wet markets. But immediately after that, some scientists suggested that that might not be the case, meaning the virus did not transmit from a pangolin to a human. Instead, the virus got leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which was actively doing a research on gain of function on bat viruses that was funded by Americans. Immediately when certain scientists put forth this hypothesis, China vigorously denied this. The Chinese called Americans or the scientists who were proposing this lab leak theory as racist. The American press ran with it, stating that whoever says that the virus leaked out of a lab are racist and bad people. But recently, on contrary to that, many scientists and researchers in the field of virology and other fields of sciences who deal with virus and development of virus and other such health experts are saying that the lab leak theory that was put forward by certain group of scientists seems to be more truer than the Chinese hypothesis of transmission of virus from animals to humans. Recently, a US intelligence report which was accessed by Wall Street Journal reported that few staff who were working in the Wuhan Institute of Virology in Hubei province fell sick in November of 2019. It indicates that the virus did leak out of Wuhan lab and not, as the Chinese are saying, transmitted from animals to humans. This indicates that the Chinese knew about the SARS-CoV-2 virus much ahead of when they declared it to the world that we are experiencing a new transmissible viral virus. So again, there has been a lot of pushback in terms of this lab leak theory, but day in, day out, there has been a new evidence emerging that is concretely supporting this lab leak theory. Now this calls for a renewed effort to conduct a deep, comprehensive and a factual investigation into the origins of coronavirus. Whatever the WHO report released a few days back is a farce because it didn't go into the Wuhan Institute of Virology and did a proper investigation. They went there, they asked the scientists working in virology lab, did you leak it or did it leak it from here? They said no, these people simply wrote what they said and came back and reported that this was not a lab leak virus. And this was actually transmissible and we may never know what the origin of coronavirus is. Now, with this new surfacing of new evidence that is mounting in support of the lab leak theory. It calls for renewed efforts for new investigations into the origins of coronavirus, which has imposed huge costs both in terms of human life and in terms of economy on all the countries in the world. Coming to the next article, FDI flows crossed 81 billion in the year 21. Now, the foreign direct investment flows into India grew by 10% to touch a record of 81.72 billion. So, one of the key reasons that we are seeing this indicator is, as we are experiencing an economic slowdown, FDIs do add up and act as a boost to our economy. Out of the investment that got into India through FDI line, Singapore emerged as the top investor, with almost third of all investments following by US, which accounted for 23% of FDI, and Mauritius, from where 9% of the flows originated. So this is a good sign in terms of the economy is on a recovery path, not to that extent of where our economy policy experts and our government is comfortable with, but these FDI investment flows do indicate a positive resurgence in Indian economy. Thank you. Stay safe. Namaste.
বৰঠাকুৰ IS একাডেমি প্ৰস্তুতি আৰু অধ্যয়নৰ নিৰ্ভৰযোগ্য ঠিকনা। বৰঠাকুৰ IS একাডেমি।